The Reconquista wasn't a single war, but a series of wars between Christian and Muslim powers in a multi-century long attempt to drive the Islamic powers off the Iberian Peninsula. It would take many generations for the Christian nations to claw their way back across Iberia, which they would eventually do after nearly 800 years. The details of many of those campaigns are lost to history, but it didn't occur without great attempts by the Islamic powers to come back across the strait and reestablish their foothold in Europe. One of the last of those attempts occurred in the 1330s when the powerful Marinid Sultanate invaded in an attempt to push back Christian gains and secure the perilous position of the Sultanate of Granada in one of the largest battles in medieval Europe. It's history that deserves to be remembered.
By the 13th century, various Christian kingdoms had coalesced and evolved into the kingdoms of Castile and Leon, which were merged in 1230 by Ferdinand III of Castile after he had inherited each of the kingdoms from his parents. During the 13th century, the power of Muslim states in the south of the peninsula collapsed after the defeat of the Almohad Caliphate at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. By 1300, the only significant Muslim power in Iberia was the Emirate of Granada, which existed as a vassal state of Castile. In 1325, King Alfonso XI of Castile was sworn in as king, and he almost immediately declared war on Granada. Between 1327 and 1333, Alfonso, today known by the epithet the Avenger, waged a successful campaign that began to close the noose on Iberia's last emirate. The Sultan of Granada, Mohammed IV, was only 10 years old when he ascended the throne in 1325. He faced a civil war that only came to an end in 1328, and in 1330 he faced a two-pronged invasion by Castile and Aragon. A treaty was signed with Castile in 1331, but almost immediately Alfonso broke its terms. Facing destruction, Muhammad sought allies, and the nearest ally was the Marinid Sultanate in what is today Morocco. The Marinids were at their height in the 14th century. In the 1260s, they repelled a Castilian invasion and reached their greatest territorial extent in the middle of the 1300s, controlling most of Maghreb from southern Morocco to Tunisia, and even briefly controlled territory as far as Tripoli in what is modern Libya. They were the only power that Muhammad could realistically turn to, and it was an opportune moment, when the Marinid Sultanate was perhaps most able to project power and most interested in expansion. It was also larger, wealthier, and more populous than Castile and Leon. In early 1333, the Marinids sent 5,000 soldiers to land at the city of Algeciras, and from there the Marinids assaulted the vital fortress of Gibraltar, which had only been captured by Castile in 1309. The Castilians were dealing with battle elsewhere and unable to send significant forces before Gibraltar fell after a 4-month siege. Alfonso had in fact been trying to reach Gibraltar and was only a few days away when the city fell in June. Alfonso immediately re-besieged Gibraltar, hoping to catch the Moors unprepared for a siege in a city that they'd only just taken by force. Ultimately, the siege ended in a stalemate and an agreement that allowed the Moors to keep the city, while the Castilians returned to deal with rebellious knights in their own territory. The agreement, however, had profound consequences. Mohammed IV, Sultan of Granada, was assassinated by some of his own men, who were disgusted at the relationship between Granada and the Marinids, and feared that Muhammad had become a Christian. Muhammad's brother and successor nevertheless held to the agreement, and for a time there was peace. The Marinids were preoccupied with war in Africa, and several peace treaties were agreed to, bringing peace between Castile, Aragon, and the Muslim powers. Both sides were aware that the peace, though, was temporary, and began preparing for the resumption of the conflict. After capturing Tlemcen in 1337, the Marinid Sultan, Abu al-Hassan, committed to a jihad against the Christians in Spain. According to the Grand Chronicle, Muslim holy men accused the Sultan of causing the death of hundreds of thousands of Moors, and al-Hassan swore that if he did not fix his tents at the gates of Seville, the whole world could say he was no king. Al-Hassan's son, Abu Malik, crossed the strait with between 4,000 and 8,000 knights, ostensibly replacements for the Marinid garrisons, but in reality a force for invasion. Malik bragged that my lances veer from the gates of Algeciras as far as Toledo, and swore to bring Muslim conquest to the peninsula. Meanwhile, the Christian powers sought peace between themselves, and Aragon, Portugal, and the Crown of Castile and Leon agreed on combined defenses to face the imminent invasion. They also sought money from the Pope to assist in Christendom's defense, as they were facing a wealthy and powerful opponent in the Marinids. In 1339, the Marinids began their campaign, devastating the countryside. Alfonso met with the Muslim forces in July, routing them. He pressed extraordinary taxes from towns to finance what looked like a long war. The Marinid prince, Abu Malik, led a raid that secured large amounts of loot, and his raiders were returning to Marinid territory when they were ambushed, and the prince killed. A later source said the battle took place on October 20th, 1339. Al-Hasan vowed revenge. A contemporary poet attributed this vow to the Marinid Sultan. I will conquer Castile and destroy Christendom, and crown myself in the city of Toledo, and there make my seat, and be called emperor. Several sources recorded that Al-Hasan received a letter from the Sultan of Babylon. An Englishman who claimed to have fought with the Castilians recorded a French translation of an original Arabic text supposedly found in a Marinid camp. The writer of this letter described himself as Lord of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and lamented the death of Abu Malik and ordered the Marinids to destroy the Christians from sea to sea. It's unclear if the letter in translation is genuine or propaganda by the Christians. The Sultan of Babylon could have been the Egyptian Sultan of the Mamluks, but the letter's authenticity is less than certain. Whether he was encouraged to attack Spain or not, the Sultan pressed his invasion. The combined Christian fleets defending the strait suffered two major setbacks in the fall of 1339 into 1340. The Catalan admiral was killed and his ships returned home, and the Castilian admiral, Alonso Tenorio, was left alone with undermanned ships. A large force of Marinids crossed the strait to Algeciras, and on April 8, 1340, the navies met. Outnumbered, the Castilian navy suffered from undermanned crews and a lack of pay, and they were caught unprepared. The Castilian navy faltered, and the admiral's ship was exposed. Thrice the Marinids attempted to board his galley, but they were repulsed. The admiral fought to the last, killed with the royal standard in one hand and a sword in the other. He was beheaded, and his body brought to the Sultan as a trophy. 35 of the 51 Castilian ships were captured. The defeat was near total, and Castile and Leon were forced to seek help to rebuild a navy. Ships came from Portugal and Aragon, and 15 ships were sent from Genoa at a price of 12,000 florins a month. Translating that into modern currency is tricky, but the gold content alone of 12,000 florins would be worth several $1 million today, and represented the annual wages of more than 1,000 skilled workers. On March 7, 1340, Pope Benedict XII declared a crusade throughout the Christian lands of Spain, which allowed the Iberian states to collect tithes and taxes to the church for their own use. The Christian powers painted a terrible picture if they were defeated. Aragonese King Pedro IV called the Moors rabid wolves, thirsting for Christian blood. Crusaders from elsewhere in Europe also flocked to Spain, with Italian sources mentioning pilgrims from France, Germany, and Italy. The pieces had been set to begin the conflict, and on October 4, 1340, Al-Hasan landed at the Muslim base at Algeciras. The Castilian Royal Chronicle offers an estimate of the size of his force at 40,000 knights and 400,000 infantry, and several other accounts are even larger, but the actual size is uncertain, although probably much smaller. Al-Hasan took his army to Tarifa and besieged it as the opening act to his campaign. Al-Hasan also made a critical mistake. Believing the Christian naval threat to have been neutralized, he dispersed most of his fleet, leaving only 12 galleys at Algeciras. Castile's rapid attempt to build, buy, or hire new galleys paid off, essentially cutting off the Muslims from their supply bases in Morocco. The Castilian forces gathered, supported by a smaller force from Portugal, prepared to relieve the siege. Although his position was becoming difficult, Al-Hasan was encouraged when a storm sank a number of Castilian ships, which he took as a sign from God that he would be successful. Despite heavy bombardment from the Marinid siege engines, Tarifa refused to surrender. In late October, the combined Castilian-Portuguese force approached the city, and Al-Hasan lifted the siege to meet them, positioning his men on a hill between Tarifa and the coast. On October 29th, Castilian forces were within 5 miles of Tarifa, and the two forces arrayed, separated by a valley crossed by streams of the Lahara and El Salado rivers. Alfonso had little in the way of supply, having had to pawn royal jewels to obtain a loan to support the campaign, so he prepared to attack on the following day. During the night, he sent 1,000 horse and 4,000 infantry to Tarifa, who passed through the Marinid defenses without much resistance. The size of the Marinid army is unclear, with one likely inflated historical estimate suggesting 53,000 knights and 600,000 infantry, facing perhaps 9,000 Christian knights and 12,000 infantry. It's safe to say the Castilian forces were probably outnumbered, though the actual numbers of Muslims was probably much smaller. Historian Joseph O'Callaghan, while determining that the reported numbers are unbelievable, said that it seems certain that both armies were the largest to engage in a pitched battle in the Iberian Peninsula in the medieval era. On the morning of October 30th, the Castilian forces marched towards the combined army of the Marinids and Granada. The battle began as Spanish forces attempted to cross the Salado Arroyo. The Muslim forces were quickly pushed back, and soldiers from Tarifa attacked from the rear, seizing the hill where Al-Hassan's camp lay with his wives and children. Alfonso himself found he and his men separated from the main body, and Marinid soldiers zeroed in on him. An arrow lodged in the king's saddle. At that moment, said the chronicler, Castile and the chivalry of Spain was at the point of being conquered. The king rallied his men with the battle cry, Santiago and Castile, and charged. Seeing their king's peril, Castilian forces, who had run ahead, turned back. The Muslim forces found themselves caught on all sides, and Al-Hassan was forced to flee, leaving his wives to the enemy. According to a later writer, when Al-Hassan had shifted his main army, the men on the flanks had panicked, thinking him defeated, and fled, leaving him exposed. The disgrace of this rout fell on Abu al-Hassan, the writer concluded, who humiliated the head of Islam and filled the idolaters with joy. The Granadan force nearby fought the Portuguese and fled even before the Marinids. Al-Hassan had time to curse that the cowardly king of Granada had been defeated. According to a Muslim vizier who fought at the battle, the Granadans had nearly overwhelmed the Portuguese when reinforcements broke the Granadan assault. Christian forces chased the fleeing army 5 miles, killing all the way. The women and children abandoned at the Muslim camp were massacred by vile men, as Christian sources put it. Al-Hassan fled to Gibraltar and immediately sailed for Morocco. As Spanish historian Jimenez Solar wrote, for the last time, Africa was expelled from Spain. The cost for the Muslim powers was great. One report said that 200,000 Moors were killed. Survivors were brought back to Morocco in only 12 galleys. Many members of the royal family had been captured, not to mention the enormous loss of valuables and gold. While the invasion had been defeated, Alfonso could not stay in the field long enough to try to press his advantage. His army withdrew on November 1st. It was a significant victory, not just because it was the last time Muslim forces from Africa would seriously attempt to seize Spain, but because the victory was accomplished by Spain alone, as the Royal Chronicle emphasized. Alfonso and his allies did this despite having the smaller, poorer, and less populous kingdom. One historian estimates that the Marinid emir had an income 20 times that of the Castilian king. Alfonso, then only 28 years old, was barely able to scrape together the money to even defend his realm. It firmly put control of the Strait of Gibraltar in the hands of Christians.
But Alfonso was unable to complete his victory. He died in 1350 while besieging Gibraltar of the Black Death, becoming one of the most prominent figures to be killed by it. His army abandoned the siege, and Gibraltar would remain in Muslim hands for the next 112 years. And the final defeat of Islam in Iberia didn't occur until 1492, when Granada finally surrendered to the combined crowns of Castile and Aragon under Isabella and Ferdinand. But the decisive victory in the 1340 Battle of Rio Salado ended any Muslim aspirations of conquest across the straits, and so played a critical role in defining the cultural and political map of modern Europe. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. Join down. Are we done? Oof.